On the second day, Roland planned to visit the library first before taking Zero to buy new clothes. Zero pouted and said quietly that Roland didn't need to buy her new clothes, to which Roland simply smiled, gently stroking her hair, remarking that her clothes, dresses, and shoes all needed a refresh. Arriving at the library, Roland found a book he was looking for. It was a book on the ratios and properties of alloys, which seemed to puzzle Zero. She couldn't grasp when her uncle had become so interested in studying. After some time, they left the library and the two spent the entire day out, playing and purchasing several sets of clothes for Zero. Before heading home after their day of shopping, Roland bought Zero a phone so they could stay in contact at any time. Zero looked at Roland for a while before accepting the phone. When Roland wakes up again, he is back in the city of Neverwinter. This time, he spent 2 days in the dream world. He stretched his hands, clenching and opening his fists, noting that other than the strange power he had in the dream world, everything else felt the same. He had many questions such as what is the magic like red mist, who is the strange man, and how did his mind created and held such a vast and complex dream world? Since he wasn't getting his answer, he decided it was futile to keep pondering. He focused on practical matters instead. Back in his office, Roland started to replicate the knowledge he had previously seen but forgotten, with a particular focus on ally compositions, which could save Anna and Lucia a great deal of experiment time. Roland needed to accelerate the industrial pace, and it was time to create more precise parts and the third-generation machine tool. The first industrial revolution was not far off for him. Carl reported that Highway 67 had been completed, and Roland was very pleased with the progress. The construction of this road was much faster thanks to the experience gained from previous projects. Carl mentioned that there had been a housing shortage recently and suggested reallocating the workforce to other construction projects if there were no further roadworks planned. Roland was aware of the situation. The town had tripled in size within a year, and the population had significantly increased. The housing shortage is an issue that can be addressed another time, but his new plan was to build a railway leading directly from the northern slope mines to the docks. This was the first time Carl heard of the concept of a railroad. Roland explained that it would be similar to the track transportation system in the mines, except that it would be entirely constructed of steel. Carl did not ask further questions, knowing that he would dedicate his full effort to any construction project Roland assigned. Roland understood that Carl might not yet grasp the full scope of what he intended to build. It was not to be a rudimentary transportation method relying on hemp ropes, steam engines, or horses, nor was it solely for transporting minerals. What Roland envisioned was a train. A revolutionary transportation system. Roland spread out the map and pointed to his railway plans, indicating the need for a team to lay the foundation first. Carl looked at Roland's proposed route and expressed concern that the tracks could be vulnerable to attacks from demonic beasts. Roland, however, was unconcerned, believing that the demonic beasts would not be interested in steel and that the project could not be completed in the short term anyway. The railway connecting the northern slope mountain to the docks was meant to be both a technical trial and a training ground for the first generation of railway workers. Taking a sip of his tea, Roland proclaimed that by the next year, they would no longer be hiding behind a wall of mud. Looking at Carl, he asked if Carl also felt that the border towns were becoming overcrowded. Carl immediately understood Roland's implication. Roland was planning an expansion. Pointing westward towards the barren wilderness, Roland spoke of its abundant resources, and they cannot defend against the demons simply relying on the walls made out of mud in the border town. He needed to transform the desolate mountain into a fortress before the Third Divine War broke out to ensure the safety of the entire kingdom. He feared that the demons could push their outposts into the ruins of Takira and potentially use the mountain paths to infiltrate into the heart of Grey Castle. Such a scenario was to be prevented at all costs. Roland pointed out that the region lacked any rivers connecting it to the inner lands, making railways the only viable option for the fast transportation of resources to the barren wilderness. Roland entrusted this mission to Carl, looking at him earnestly, expressing his firm belief in Carl's capabilities. Incorporating the desolate mountain into the kingdom's territory was a prospect that could excite any stonemason, as constructing such fortifications would surely secure their name in historical records. At the thought of this, Carl moved and with a fervent tone, responded, "Yes, Your Majesty." Roland handed Carl another blueprint, which would be a landmark building in the city of Neverwinter. Carl looked at the plans with disbelief. A 15-story building, each floor at 3.5 meters, resulting in a total height of 50 meters. Carl realized this structure was going to be extraordinary. However, he had some doubts. Could a residential building be built this high? Roland, with a smile, reassured him that for concrete, this was far from the limit, and promised to personally guide Carl in the construction process. In the witch classroom, Scroll tapped on the desk signaling the end of the exam. Evelyn breathed a sigh of relief, having finally caught up with everyone else's progress, and hoped her grades would meet expectations. She noticed that Anna was still absent. According to Wendy, Anna's level was so advanced that others would only get a headache trying to read her books. Candle, giving her a thumbs up, indicated she probably did well on her exam. Nightingale, sitting at the back, still looked worried. Turning to see Maisie's adorable expression, Evelyn smiled. 3 days later, the exam results came out. Scroll told Evelyn to keep up the good work. Evelyn was delighted with her score of 113, but surprisingly, Maisie scored an unexpected 117. Everyone crowded around Maisie's exam result, incredulous at how she could score so high without any multiple-choice questions on the exam this time. Rem remembered that when the exam papers were collected, much of Maisie's sheet was blank, with drawings of honey jerky filling the rest. Could this have been a mistake? They were curious and wanted to find out what happened. They couldn't just sneak into the office to check the exam paper. With Roland, Nightingale, and Scroll all heading to the Changu stronghold, no one would lead them to the office. They thought for a moment and then they thought of Summer. Remembering that Scroll often marked their exams in the office located in the city hall, and the education department's office was on the second floor, they wondered how they could get in. Candle thought of someone. Not long after, they found Nanawa and asked her to lead them into the city hall. Nanawa's popularity was so high that everyone in the city hall greeted her, and no one stopped her from heading to the second floor. The group quickly made their way to the second floor, opened the office door, and Summer used her ability to retrace Scroll grading the exam papers. When they got to Maisie's paper, it was indeed mostly blank with various food drawings. In the end, Scroll had given Maisie a score of 17. Maisie said, with a pout, saying she didn't lie. Everyone here knew Maisie very well enough to know she wasn't lying. But what had happened? Not long after, they saw a city hall official come to report work to Scroll, and after he left, a gust of wind suddenly blew the window open, causing all the exam papers on the table, including the feather pen, to fly up. The feather pen landed exactly on Maisie's exam paper. The tip of the pen first hit the ground, and accidentally made a line on Maisie's score, turning the 17 into a triple-digit 117. The investigation ended like a farce, and everyone left with a laugh. Evelyn returned to the witch's building, thinking back on the incident. The fluttering papers and falling feather pen, which had no relation to each other, had formed such an interesting coincidence. Not just the paper and pen, but the airflow from the window and the timing of the official's entrance were all part of the result. Any missing element would have prevented the change in exam score. This made Evelyn quickly correlate with mixing drinks. When various ingredients to a cocktail, they blend and influence each other in the drink. Every acceptable flavor requires countless trials, and sometimes a random combination creates those unique tastes. Evelyn returned to her room with thoughts swirling in her mind. Closing her eyes, she felt something within her yearning to come out. Using her power, she felt the changes of her magic, and with a sudden jolt, she opened her eyes and grasped a cup on the table. The water inside had changed color, turning a gradual shade of orange-red, and an unfamiliar but pleasant fragrance wafted to her nose. Tasting it, she experienced an indescribable sweetness that spread across her tongue. It was like a mix of fruit juice and milk, or perhaps a blend of tea and honey, but Evelyn couldn't precisely describe the flavor. One thing she was sure of, it was definitely not alcohol. A few days later, Roland had returned from the Changji stronghold, and Evelyn went to see Roland. Nightingale immediately noticed a change in Evelyn's magical core. Her magical core had formed into a gray orb, and the amount of magic was substantial, likely comparable to Leaf or Agatha. Evelyn also brought 3 beverages she created using her new ability, which piqued Roland's curiosity. He took out a cup and poured a little of each drink for himself. Tasting the first beverage, he encountered an indescribable delight. The second cup was even more delicious, starting with a hot surge, like lava flowing into the mouth, followed by a smoky fragrance as if the tongue was toasted, and ending with the fresh scent of juicy fruits and a subtle intoxicating effect of alcohol. The longer the drink was savored, the more prolonged the aftertaste, making it an irresistible beverage for winter. When asked if it could be mass-produced, Evelyn replied that she was unable to replicate the previous result, and her ability followed no discernible rules. Roland understood why Evelyn seemed so troubled despite her ability evolving. Regaining confidence for a witch like her would indeed take time. But he certainly didn't consider her ability useless. Smiling at Evelyn, he reassured her that the inability to replicate the beverages was not an issue. He earnestly told her that the exquisite flavors and unique experiences they provided were more enchanting and memorable. He suggested that if soldiers of the First Army were at the front line and could have a taste of such a drink from the city of Neverwinter, it would undoubtedly boost their morale. Roland planned to create a storage room for Evelyn's beverages and encouraged her to continue using her ability. He believed that everyone would be fascinated by Evelyn's creations. As for the beverage's name, he decided they should be collectively called Chaos Drinks. 3 days earlier, astrologers from the old royal capital had arrived in Neverwinter, and Roland planned to host a welcome banquet in the square this evening to celebrate their arrival. Barav appeared hesitant, curious about what Roland had discovered during his recent visit to the Changji stronghold. Roland was disappointed to report that the Changji district's city hall had begun to show signs of dereliction of duty and bribery, with forged accounting found in some of the books. Even more troubling, 2 officials originally from the border town were caught due to corruption. Barav, looking concerned, inquired if any of his disciples were involved. Roland reassured him that none were implicated this time and that even if they were, Barav wouldn't be held responsible. Barav quickly praised Roland's wisdom. These rule breakers will be dealt with severely as a warning to others, underscoring the importance of maintaining integrity and discipline within the ranks. Roland decided to gather all of the city hall staff the next day for a meeting, which he intended to personally conduct. After Barav left, Roland pondered the situation. With Scroll and Nightingale around, they could temporarily ensure the integrity of the officials, but this approach would undoubtedly put the witches back into a precarious position, potentially leading to internal conflicts. The 2 corrupt officials were originally commoners from the border town, part of the second batch of graduates who entered the city hall after passing the assessments. Roland was dismayed that such corruption had emerged in less than a year. The city halls of Changji Stronghold and Dragon Fall Ridge were staffed by some officials from the border town, who were known for their administrative experience and good performance, alongside with local nobles. The loss of several experienced officials naturally left Roland feeling disheartened. He had hoped that the organization would remain uncorrupted for at least a decade, but it had barely lasted a year before these issues arose. The fact that both of these caught corrupted officials were from common folk backgrounds somewhat proved that once in power, they might lose to greed more easily than other nobles. Standing up and looking at the setting sun, Roland knew these issues needed early intervention. After the evening's welcome banquet, the chief astrologer entered Roland's study. Putting down his pen, Roland gestured for the chief to sit. With a smile, Roland poured him a cup of tea. The chief seemed pleasantly surprised by this gesture. Roland then spoke about the matter of the Red Moon, a rumor that dated back a millennium, a time long before Greycastle or the Wimbledon lineage. The chief mentioned that the recorded history only spanned 450 years. Roland shook his head, explaining that it wasn't a lack of records, but a deliberate concealment. Roland discussed the demons, the Old Witch Kingdom, the history of the 4 great kingdoms, and the church. When Roland finished, the chief astrologer felt breathless, having always thought the red moon signified a doomsday caused by severe natural disasters.
Yet, according to Roland, it was a signal for the demons to attack.
The chief remained silent for a long time, unsure whether to believe this horrifying theory. However, he soon realized that Roland had no reason to deceive him. If all this were true, then the king's attitude towards witches made complete sense. The young king had not spread all the information across the kingdom, carefully concealing facts that could cause panic, a decision that was undoubtedly correct and wise. The chief realized the gravity of the situation and asked what he could do for Roland. Sipping his tea, Roland pulled out a notebook and handed it to the chief, who saw the words analytical geometry written on it. While he recognized the words individually, he was unsure of their combined meaning. Upon opening the first page, the chief astrologer read a few lines with intrigue. The idea of using mathematical formulas to describe the trajectory of objects, and the possibility of determining their entire trajectory with key parameters, deeply captivated him. The illustrations in the book further drew his attention.
Roland explained that these were mathematical formulas.
Despite the vast differences in the shapes of the figures, their mathematical expressions were not significantly distinct.
A compelling thought arose in the chief's mind: could it be that all shapes in the world could be represented by a mathematical formula?
Filled with excitement, he eagerly turned to the second page.
Roland did not interrupt the chief as he read through this fascinating book.
The chief had many questions about the book, as the symbols and expressions were not like those taught in the court, and he struggled to understand these equations. Roland then presented another book, assuring the chief that he would understand the first book after studying this one. The chief's hands trembled slightly as he looked at the book titled Equations and Mathematical Formulas. He asked incredulously if he could take it home to read. Roland affirmed, expressing his hope that all astrologers and their disciples would learn from these books. He also advised the chief not to worry too much about the red moon, emphasizing that only by mastering these subjects could the astrological society play an irreplaceable role in the future war against the demons.
Roland explained that these books were just an introduction and that there was much more profound knowledge in the future.
These formulas could describe everything from blades of grass to the stars in the sky, everything one could see. When asked if he was willing to accept this challenge, the chief astrologer responded without hesitation. Meanwhile, in the city of Dawn, York was enjoying the close service of number 76. Just as he was about to take things further, the door burst open. York looked displeasedly at Hill, then stood up. "Don't tell me you need me to save another witch," he said.
Hill didn't respond, but instead looked towards number 76.
Sensing the situation, number 76 respectfully bowed and quickly left the room.
York thought Hill was being overly cautious.
He mentioned that Hill wasn't this cautious with Denise. Hill earnestly replied that Denise's background could be thoroughly checked by various means, but number 76, being a trained guide by the expedition, had no such traceable background. York countered that he had discovered a lot about number 76. To train a skilled guide took over a decade, and number 76 was only in her early 20s. He reasoned that number 76 was just a child when she began her training and had no vested interest in their affairs.
York remarked cynically, saying witches don't need our protection anyways.
Seeing Hill momentarily speechless, York felt a sense of satisfaction. Then, Hill handed York a letter. Upon reading the first few lines, York was struck by the content writing in the letter.
The letter that York received was an official diplomatic letter issued in the name of King Roland of Greycastle.
The letter stated that the King of Greycastle sought to stop the King of the Kingdom of Dawn from continuing the persecution of witches.
York couldn't believe it. This was the Kingdom of Dawn's royal capital, not the western territory of Greycastle. How could York, a small ambassador, intervene in another kingdom's affairs?
Hill, however, remarked that for King Roland, witches were far more important than treaties. York felt at a loss for words. Hill was the only one who could advise him now. Hill's suggestion was to immediately follow the king's instructions, as it was York's duty as an ambassador. He assured York that the worst outcome would be getting kicked out of the palace by Enpian. York was frustrated, knowing that the relationships he had built with other nobles here would be ruined, and all the things he had been working on for the two kingdoms' alliance would also be gone. Perhaps the nobles here would ridicule Greycastle as being crazy, and make His Majesty Roland a topic of gossip at banquets.
York couldn't understand why Roland would issue such an empty threat.
Hill, looking at York, asked if he really thought His Majesty was merely bluffing.
York, startled, stood up.
Hill slowly mentioned that before the fall of the old royal capital, Timothy also thought the same.
Their king would never do anything meaningless.
York sat down and nodded, deciding to write a formal letter to Anpian for an official visit.
The following day, York met with Anpian. Bowing in respect, he was told by Anpian to rise and read him Roland's letter.
With a strained composure, York conveyed King Roland's congratulations on Anpian's coronation and expressed hope for the enduring friendship between the two kingdoms.
Anpian showed a interest on Roland's unique way of greeting, but was more interested in the gifts.
York, never heard anything about gifts, thinking quickly, said the gift caravan was still on its way, and the letter had been delivered by a fast horse. Anpian reminisced about when Roland's father, Wimbledon III, was crowned. Recalling how his own father had sent a 200-person delegation to Greycastle with 11 carriages of gifts including gold, fine wines, silk, and beautiful women.
Anpian expressed anticipation about what Roland's gift might be.
York was sweating profusely.
Anpian, visibly pleased, asked York if King Roland had said anything else.
For a moment, York considered resigning from his role as ambassador, but he knew he couldn't disappoint his best friend, also the King of Greycastle. Taking a deep breath, he delivered Roland's message with deliberate emphasis, requesting Anpian to stop persecuting witches and treat them as free citizens. Otherwise, Greycastle would not turn a blind eye to such conduct, giving the church a prime example.
The entire palace fell into a tense silence after York finished speaking.
Anpian demanded to see the letter himself, disbelieving that Roland would make such a statement. He snatched the scroll from York's hand and read through the extensive condemnation and warning. After reading, Anpian furiously threw the letter to the ground, slamming his hand on his chair, causing his guards to instinctively reach for their swords. Anpian, enraged, declared that witches were abhorrent and minions of the demons, blaming them for poisoning his father, who would otherwise be sitting there healthy.
York thought to himself that if Anpian's father hadn't died, Anpian wouldn't be king.
A thought in his mind, yet he dared not to voice it aloud. He tried to explain that the witches raised by the church were different from others, but Anpian refused to listen, believing all witches were minions of demons. Anpian approached York, scoffing at Roland's threat, declaring he would write to the King of Greycastle, warning him not to be seduced by witches. He boasted that while Greycastle might be powerful, it relied on its nobles, who played a crucial part in defeating the church.
Anpian warned not to underestimate the Kingdom of Dawn, implying that Greycastle's nobility might not always support Roland.
Just like what happened to Timothy.
Someone else could easily rise to the throne.
Seeing Anpian's flushed and furious face, and these nonsense statements, York realized that Anpian had yet to grow out of his father's shadows, and that compared to Roland, Anpian was far inferior as a king. York didn't even want to waste his time explaining how Roland had defeated the church without relying on the nobility and had even stripped them of their rights. As Hill had predicted, the furious Anpian banished York from the palace. Returning to his residence, York was visited by Otto, who had heard about the incident. Otto mentioned that Anpian's new policies were causing unrest among ministers and nobles, but Anpian refused to heed anyone's advice.
Otto wished Anpian could be as prudent as King Roland.
York recalled that in the palace, the ministers and nobles seemed shocked. But none of them had supported the king's outburst. He wondered if Roland's prestige had really grown that powerful.
Otto expressed his disappointment but resolved to continue discussions with Anpian.
At that moment, number 76 entered, informing York that the witch they had auctioned, Amy, had returned. Quickly, number 76 led Amy into the room. Upon seeing York, Amy urgently grasped his arm, pleading for his help. York, somewhat helpless but sympathetic, asked her to sit down and explain the situation. Amy recounted that when she went out alone to find food, she returned to find their hiding place surrounded by soldiers. Soldiers were searching every house for witches. Other than her and Annie, there were two more witches, one of whom had lost her legs and could only move with Annie's assistance. They were defenseless. York thought it was a troublesome situation, regretting that they hadn't heeded his advice to go to Grey Castle for safety earlier. Otto asked where Mr. Hill was, but York didn't know, noting Hill's tendency to appear and disappear without a trace. Otto decided to seek out Earl Quinn, hoping he might provide an escape opportunity for the witches. York doubted Quinn would listen to him. Otto sighed, saying he had to try, especially since Andrea was Quinn's biological daughter. Time passed, and Otto did not return. Amy, traumatized, eventually fell asleep. York lamented the witch's situation. Hill returned and told York it was time to evacuate alongside the witches. Hill had bribed the local rats, who had rescued the three witches. However, Hill felt something was strange. The witches had been surrounded by soldiers when found, suggesting that Anpian had known their hiding place all along. It seemed the witches had been deliberately let go, possibly as a trap to catch more hidden witches or to identify those supporting them. If York continues to stay in the capital would become dangerously risky. They needed to leave immediately, but Hill had to stay behind, as they needed someone to keep scouting. York looked at Hill with concern, asking what would happen if he was caught. Hill smiled, noting he was just a nameless, faceless person, hidden in the shadows and essentially non-existent. York ultimately listened to Hill's advice and departed from the royal capital in a carriage as the evening sun slowly set. The camp they set up in a remote area was well organized by Hill's reliable arrangements. With food already prepared and handed to him, York finally realized why Hill had chosen to transport these particular items. With 2 carts full of food, their group could comfortably survive on the road for a month or two. These so-called merchandise being more than sufficient for everyone's needs. Annie looked at York apologetically for her previous outburst. Although York hadn't handed them over to Anpian, she still couldn't fully trust him. Amy, puzzled, insisted that York was a good person. York suggested that Annie might still be skeptical about the witch organization in Grey Castle, possibly assuming that nobles kept witches for amusement. Annie nodded, adding that deception and exploitation were more common concerns she had about King Roland. York didn't want to explain too much since they could see with their own eyes once they returned to Grey Castle. Annie promised to formally apologize to York if what he said about the witches in Grey Castle was true. The atmosphere turned awkward for a moment until number 76 broke the silence. She asked if all 4 of them were from the kingdom of Wolfheart. Annie nodded. Noticing one of the witch without legs, number 76 asked if her injuries were from the church's pursuers. To everyone's surprise, Annie said her legs were cut off by the people who had been guarding her. Followed by saying in the most desperate moments in Wolfheart, Hero stood up for everyone, only to be met with hatred from the people. Number 76 expressed a desire to know more, and York also showed interest in hearing the story. Taking a deep breath, Annie began to narrate their tale. A year ago, when the church's army attacked Wolfheart City, they hurled corpses infected with the demonic plague into the city. Thanks to Hero using her ability, the plague did not spread uncontrollably. Hero's magical ability could transfer the disease from infected people to other living beings, thereby preventing the epidemic's spread. She transferred the disease of the infected to animals and then burned them in a pit, saving countless lives. Initially, she was hailed as the savior of Wolfheart City and revered as a hero. However, the number of animals available was limited. As the war dragged on, the focus shifted to using living humans. Sensing Hero's mood changing and her body shivering, number 76 moved closer to Hero, embracing her gently, whispering that none of it was her fault. Tears streamed down Hero's face. Annie explained that Hero refused to comply, but she wasn't given a choice. The first to be thrown into the fire were criminals, prisoners, and volunteers, and later, it included the elderly, injured soldiers, and prisoners of war from the church's judgment army. Despite the pressure, Hero refused to comply with these demands and would not take action against humans. As a result, the people's attitude towards her changed. They imprisoned her, and as the city fell, a guard whom she had treated before cruelly cut off her legs with an axe and set the prison cell on fire. However, what the guard didn't anticipate was that the person who saved the immobilized hero was a prisoner of the church's judgment army, who was also confined in the same cell.
York was surprised to learn that a devout follower of the church would ever save a witch.
Everyone's attention was focused on Annie as she continued the story. The remaining Judgment Army prisoners had rescued Hero from her cell. It was under their protection that she managed to evade the church's subsequent manhunt for witches. After the war, the surviving Judgment soldiers even provided her with food, clothing, and a place to stay for a while.
They continued to support Hero until the church's army returned to Hermes.
Before they departed, each of the soldiers who had been in the prison came to express their gratitude to her.